Next item of business is a debate on motion 20049 in the name of Michael Russell on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representations Bill at Stage 1. Can I invite those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now. I call on Michael Russell to speak to and move the motion. Mr Russell, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And at the outset, the Chamber might like to note that this is the first Stage 1 debate of a bill which will require a supermajority to pass at its final stage. That means that two-thirds of all members will have to support the bill when that moment comes next year. But I think we are off to a good start, given that the Standards Procedure and Public Appointments Committee has recommended support for the general principles after its scrutiny of the bill, though there wasn't except one party against much of it. I'm grateful for the committee for its thoughtful consideration of the bill, and I hope to persuade even that one party to back it when it comes to its final stage next year. As members will be aware, new powers over elections and the franchise were devolved by the Scotland Act 2016. This Parliament can now take decisions about key Scottish electoral issues. Though regrettably, there are still franchise matters being dealt with outside Scotland, including Westminster's continued refusal to give the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds, which will be, of course, obvious again in 2 weeks' time. This bill before Parliament has two main aims: to extend voting and candidacy rights to foreign nationals, and to ensure that we are compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights in relation to prisoner voting. The bill's provisions on foreign nationals will, I hope, contribute to the building of an open, outward-looking, inclusive Scotland. The provisions on prisoner voting rectify a legal problem and are also progressive. Let me start with the provisions for foreign nationals. We've got used to having in our franchise EU nationals and Commonwealth citizens. Had our franchise been used for the whole of the UK in the EU referendum, then the result might well have been different. There is a beneficial effect in ensuring that all citizens who have a stake in the future of the country are empowered to exercise their choice about that future. If people have chosen to build a life here, they should have the right to vote in our elections. But EU and Commonwealth citizens are not the only people who shape Scottish society through deciding to come here to live, to study, to work, and to raise families as our friends and neighbours. So it is time we recognise that anomaly and enfranchised all those citizens from around the world who live and work amongst us. Migration is central to the development of Scotland as an inclusive, prosperous and innovative country which is ready and willing to embrace the future. While control over migration policy is reserved, I think it is right that we use the powers that we have now, not just to send a strong message about what Scotland wants to be, an open country, an inclusive community, a nation which values everyone who makes their home here, but also to ensure that we benefit from the contribution that such citizens wish to make. Of course.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. I understand that he wants to equate the franchise in Scotland with residency. He will understand, I think, equally, that there is a tradition that equates franchise not with everyone who's lawfully resident here, but with citizenship. If he wants to break the link between franchise and citizenship, can I ask him this? What does he think citizenship is for, and what value does he think citizenship should add if it isn't the right to vote?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm not going to go into a dissertation on citizenship here. What I'm talking about is whether, if you are a member of a society and you're resident in that society, you should have the chance to take part in decisions about that society. That's a principle we're discussing here today. And in addition, no franchise stands still. I know that the term conservative means that you conserve what you believe to be good and you believe it should not change. But franchises are dynamic, and they should be dynamic. And this franchise needs to continue to change, as all franchises need to change. So let me continue. Scotland actually agrees with the position that I have taken and I'm outlining. Over 3/4 of the respondents to the consultation were supportive of extending the franchise in this way. And that sends a message about not just what Scotland wants to be, but about what Scotland is. Political participation is a vital part of a person's integration. We're therefore proposing one of the most open approaches to voting rights in the world, which will highly significantly include enfranchising refugees with leave to remain. Now, the committee has asked the Scottish Government to consider if we could go even further. I've listened to the compelling arguments presented by several witnesses to the committee regarding pending asylum seekers. I'm far from unsympathetic, but I have to acknowledge a number of practical reasons why I'm not yet able to take that step. Asylum policy is not devolved, and Home Office data suggests that around 50% of asylum claims are ultimately unsuccessful. This raises questions about how the integrity of the electoral register could be maintained if individuals are registered to vote and then denied the leave to remain. Secondly, the bill as drafted will add at least 55,000 foreign nationals to the electoral roll, and coping with that will be a challenge for electoral registration officers. I'm sure they are equal to the challenge, but asylum seekers will not typically have a national insurance number, and there are then questions about the documentation they can reasonably be expected to provide to registration officers and the time each individual registration would take. But as I've said, I was just coming to a point with Mr. Ruskell. So I've said I do have considerable sympathy for the benefits of extending rights to those who have come to our country in the most traumatic circumstances, as my concerns are fundamentally those of practicality, efficiency and good administration. I will therefore undertake to consider the issue further as the bill progresses. I have already met Mr. Ruskell to discuss the issue, and perhaps he would like to make his point now.
Mark Ruskell.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way? Just in relation to verification, I wondered if him or his officials have considered whether asylum registration cards, which of course are a form of photo ID, perhaps provide an adequate form of verification for electoral registration officers.
Cabinet Secretary.
As I've indicated to Mr. Ruskell before, and I want to do it again here, I'm always open to ideas on this. One possibility might be to effect a change at a later date than the rest of the bill to take in some of those issues and to examine them, allowing greater time to address practical constraints. And I have this week written to the committee to that effect. The bill as introduced also extends candidacy rights to foreign nationals with indefinite leave to remain. This is the approach adopted by the Welsh Government in its own franchise legislation approved yesterday. But again, the committee has asked us to go further and find a way to afford any foreign national able to vote in our elections the right to stand as a candidate. Now, once again, I can see the attraction in such a move, but it does present a clear risk of persons being elected who may lose the right to reside in the country before the end of their term, or even before polling day itself. Because although a leave to remain can be extended, it can also be refused or curtailed early. There is therefore a danger that we would effectively be building in a potentially significant number of by-elections into our system, which might be costly and disruptive. And just one moment. Moreover, immigration policy is reserved, and there are a number of complex factors at work in relation to leave to remain.
Neil Finlay.
Except it's a bit of a stretch to think, given what we would expect, very small numbers involved, that there's going to be some big list of by-elections that are going to occur. And does he accept also that there are many reasons why someone who's elected does not fulfil their term? So it's no different.
With respect, I think it is different. You are, in those circumstances, you would be giving somebody the right to stand who could not, in any sense, be confident that they would be able to fill out their term. Very often, individuals are confident they can, and then something happens to them. So I think it's not right to dismiss this issue. I'm taking it very seriously, and I'm taking the issues seriously and trying to explore them. I'm not dismissing them. I'm making it clear I am taking them seriously, but I'm not going to hide from the practical difficulties. I've also reflected upon the concerns raised in relation to support for local authorities in handling these changes, and have undertaken to the committee that additional funding will be provided. Let me now turn to the bill's provisions in relation to prisoner voting at Scottish Parliament and local government elections. I recognise that the idea of prisoners being able to vote can arouse a wide range of views. In 2017, the Parliament's Equality and Human Rights Committee recommended allowing all prisoners to vote, whereas the UK Government limits prisoner voting to only those on remand or temporary release. Presiding Officer, whatever a member's personal view on this matter, it is clear that the Parliament as a whole must act, because the current ban on prisoner voting is untenable under human rights law and has been for some years. Consequently, doing nothing is not an option, a position with which the committee agrees, having taken evidence on the matter. The reason for that, Presiding Officer, is that in 2005, the European Court of Human Rights found a UK blanket ban on prisoner voting to be in breach of Article 3 of Protocol 1 of the European Convention. We received powers over our franchise 3 years ago. As a result, we are obliged to take action to ensure that we are ECHR compliant. Those familiar with the Hearst ruling will know that the court allows member states a wide margin of appreciation in relation to the exercise of the franchise by convicted prisoners. Indeed, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to ensuring compliance across Europe. We consider that our proposal of allowing prisoners serving sentences of 12 months or less to vote falls within that margin of appreciation. The committee has questioned the 12-month period, but it has a solid grounding. Firstly, 12 months is the maximum sentence that a judge can pass in cases heard without a jury. Secondly, it is a threshold for the government's new presumption against short sentences. And thirdly, it was the most favoured option of the periods in which we consulted earlier this year. Could you allow me to make some progress? There were, of course, other views. Some proposed a different sentence threshold or the complete lifting of the ban. The committee has also questioned a 12-month proposal, suggesting, for example, that the presumption against short sentences would effectively mean that few prisoners would be enfranchised. However, my colleague, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, has been clear that the presumption is not a ban. It seeks to encourage the courts to consider alternatives to custody which can be more effective in rehabilitating individuals, but there will always be crimes where the court decides that imprisonment is the correct course. And there is a link between the two policies for both the presumption against short sentences and the proposal to allow prisoners serving 12 months or less to vote. Our approach is rooted in inclusion and a desire for rehabilitation through active citizenship. I therefore believe that the bill as drafted contains a clear, principled and practical position, and I ask members to endorse it. I'll take the point from Mr.
Tompkins.
Very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I don't disagree with him at all when he says that the proposals in the bill are likely to fall within the margin of appreciation afforded by Strasbourg to Member States. My question is, however, whether the bill goes further in enfranchising prisoners than is necessary to meet the requirements of the Council of Europe. Are there not smaller steps that could and should be taken instead of enfranchising all prisoners who are subject to jail terms of less than 12 months?
Cabinet Secretary.
The government has taken a very much smaller step, but that smaller step has not yet been challenged. And I think, as Mr. Tompkins will know, and he is more experienced in these matters than I am in terms of matters of the law, the likelihood of challenge, the smaller step you take, increases. There is a relationship between the two. I've argued, and I go back to this point because it's key, this is proportionate. There is a strong reasoning behind it. I've laid it out here, and it actually fulfills. There was no period in the consultation which had a majority, but it was the one that found most favour. So I think there are strong arguments for taking this approach, which is an approach that we do believe is appropriate, and I'm glad that Mr. Tompkins agrees it's likely to be so. Can I just say that there is no... These are important steps forward for our franchise and for our society. And as there's no clear consensus emerging in the committee in favour of an alternative period, or even lifting the ban in its entirety, then I do think that our approach is one founded on clear reasoning. And there is a practical concern which some have articulated also regarding the difficulty of having large numbers of prisoners registering to vote at a specific prison. But this is a worry not based on fact. The bill is clear that voting will occur by postal or proxy vote only, and that prisoners would ordinarily and virtually universally be registered to vote in an area in which they lived prior to conviction. Presiding Officer, this bill will achieve two distinct but equally important objectives. It will guarantee ECHR compliance with regards to prisoner voting, which we must do, and include in our franchise all who make Scotland our home, which we should do. These are important steps forward for our franchise and our society. I thank the committee for its engagement with these issues so far, and I look forward not just to this afternoon's debate, but to the remaining stages of the bill early next year, providing the Chamber, of course, approves the general principles today. So I move that the Parliament agrees to the general principles of the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Bill Kidd on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Mr. Kidd, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. As convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public and Appointments Committee, it is my pleasure to speak in this debate on behalf of the committee. I would like to thank all of those who provided evidence on the bill, as well as my fellow committee members for the constructive way in which they approached the committee's Stage 1 report. While we did not agree on all of the conclusions and recommendations, we were very civil in agreeing not to agree every important aspect of detail. The committee recognises that this bill represents the first significant use of the increased autonomy provided to the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Ministers by the Scotland Act 2016 in relation to the operation of Scottish Parliament and local government elections. In this speech, I will cover the committee's main conclusions and recommendations in relation to the two main areas of the bill. Firstly, the rights of foreign nationals to vote and stand in elections, and secondly, the rights of prisoners serving sentences of 12 months or less to vote. Those that provided evidence to the committee welcomed the proposal to extend the franchise to foreign nationals. The International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance told us that while citizenship has historically and often constitutionally been a requirement to exercise the right to vote, and increasingly mobile to reconsider the link between citizenship and voting rights to address democratic deficits and to support the social and political integration of non-citizens. It further stated that introducing voting rights for non-citizens would be both symbolically and practically a step towards removing barriers for inclusion and strengthening overall political participation. This was a view echoed in an informal meeting with representatives from refugee communities organised by the Scottish Refugee Council. They told us very clearly that having the right to vote would support their social and political integration into Scottish society. And I would like to quote two of the participants from the meeting organised by the Scottish Refugee Council. Firstly, Alam al-Bashiri told us how important gaining the vote would be for her in order that she could feel that she belonged in Scotland and had equal rights to other people. And she said, "I need this right. I need to feel that this place is my place as much as anyone in here. I should have equal rights the same as anyone in Scotland." And secondly, Sergi Kasongo emphasised that refugees contributed to Scotland by working, but still did not have the right to vote. He said, "We contribute to this country by working, but we can't contribute our voice. There should be more equality." Under current arrangements, EU citizens and qualifying Commonwealth citizens resident in Scotland have the right to vote in Scottish Parliament and local government elections, but other foreign nationals such as Japanese or US citizens do not. The bill proposes to provide a uniform right to vote in Scottish elections to all foreign nationals who are legally resident in Scotland. The Scottish Government estimates that 55,000 people would gain the right to vote as a result of this proposal. And given the numbers of people who would be added to the electoral register, the committee questioned witnesses about how quickly this could be achieved. We were told by the Scottish Assessors Association that it would be manageable to get this number of people on the register before the 2021 Scottish elections. I mentioned that the committee did not agree on all of the provisions of the bill, but the majority of the committee did welcome the extension of the vote to foreign nationals on the basis that we believe that people who live and contribute in the country should also have the right to vote in elections to local government and the Scottish Parliament, as both of these bodies will develop and agree policies that affect those individuals. We also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to promote engagement with the Scottish Refugee Council and other organisations working at local level across Scotland to provide support and information on the electoral system and voter registration to those who would be enfranchised by the bill if enacted. The bill also proposes to allow all foreign nationals with an indefinite right to live in Scotland to stand as candidates in Scottish elections and to hold office if elected. Again, this addresses the current anomaly in relation to those who can stand as candidates in Scottish elections by providing more uniform rights. However, the requirement to have the indefinite right to live in Scotland means that refugees and asylum seekers cannot stand if they do not have indefinite leave to remain. The majority of the committee therefore called on the Scottish Government to look to bring the candidacy provisions for foreign nationals in line with the franchise provisions. The committee also called on the Scottish Government to address the anomaly whereby there will be no requirement for EU and European Economic Area nationals to have an indefinite right to remain in order to stand for elections, unlike other foreign nationals. I will now turn to prisoner voting. Members may be interested to note that we were informed by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons that there was no ban on prisoner voting between 1949 and 1969, and that prior to 1949, only prisoners convicted of the most serious crimes were banned from voting. The European Convention on Human Rights requires states to hold free elections at reasonable intervals by secret ballot under conditions which will ensure the free expression of the opinion of the people within the ECHR in relation to prisoner voting in these elections. This bill seeks to comply with the ECHR by proposing that those serving sentences of 12 months or less should have the right to vote. Yes.
Liam Kerr.
The member would presumably concede then that the ECHR doesn't contain a specific right to vote.
Bill Kidd.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. The bill seeks to comply by proposing that those serving sentences of 12 months or less should have the right to vote. So we are, in that instance, we believe in the committee, complying with the ECHR in that instance. The committee agreed that a blanket ban on prisoner voting is unsustainable, as it would be at odds with the ECHR, but concluded that the Scottish Government had settled on an approach which fails to address the central question of what disenfranchisement achieves. In particular, the committee felt that there was a need for further evidence as to why the Scottish Government had settled on an approach of enfranchising those sentenced to 12 months or less. In addition, the committee note that very few people would be enfranchised by this proposal, given the presumption against sentences of 12 months or less. The committee heard a number of arguments and evidence for setting the cut-off point at 4 years, which marks the delineation between short-term and long-term sentences. Indeed, both the Law Society of Scotland and the Faculty of Advocates indicated a preference on their part for a 4-year cut-off point. The committee also heard arguments in favour of enfranchising all prisoners. The case was made that gaining the right to vote could contribute to the rehabilitation of prisoners, reducing their sense of alienation and marginalisation. It would also recognise prisoners as citizens in wider society. Furthermore, the weaknesses of losing the right to vote as a deterrent were stressed. No clear consensus emerged in the committee in favour of any specific alternative. In terms of practicalities of registering prisoners and them exercising their right to vote, the bill provides for prisoners to be registered by reference to their previous home address or by a declaration of local connection which allows them to be allocated to an electoral community. The prisoners will then be allowed to vote only by proxy or postal vote. The committee received evidence from the Scottish Prison Service and Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, which was broadly content with the arrangements in relation to proxy or postal voting, and satisfied that there will be sufficient means for prisoners to access information on candidates and political parties. Before concluding, I will turn briefly to the financial memorandum. The committee raised concerns about the costs on local authorities and the cost of adapting electoral management systems and software to respond to the changes in the franchise. The estimated costs which will be incurred by local authorities are estimated to be around £200,000. While the financial memorandum envisaged that these costs would fall on local authorities, the Cabinet Secretary has since written to the committee to indicate that he is persuaded to accommodate further funding to cover costs which will be incurred by returning officers arising from an increase in the number of people who are able to vote once the franchise has been extended to foreign nationals. I will conclude by saying that the majority of the committee supported the general principles of the bill, although there are a number of conclusions and recommendations in which, as I have indicated, we will call either for further clarification or for the Scottish Government to reconsider some of these proposals at stage 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I echo the comments of the convener of the committee that while we didn't always agree, it was a very constructive discussion that we had. And can I also, as a member of the Standards Committee, thank our ever-diligent clerking team for their work around the Stage 1 report that we have before us today. There are two main areas within the bill, and I intend to take them in turn. The first part of this is, of course, voting by foreign nationals. The Scottish Government broadly seeks to extend the right to vote in elections to the Scottish Parliament and to local authorities to persons regardless of their nationality and citizenship status. Few countries around the world allow for such a wide franchise. In most other nations, quite reasonably, voting is tied to citizenship in one form or another. In others, foreign nationals are able to vote, but with the requirement that a minimum period of residence in the country has been fulfilled. Unlike in the case of European citizens, there is no reciprocal agreement, and none has been sought from other countries. Equally, evidence received by the committee has shown that increasing the voter rolls will not necessarily increase participation in elections, and that other barriers may well be more important. Another issue is one of residence and permanency. While the current system is perhaps not perfect, the bill will extend voting rights to relatively temporary residents. Indeed, it will be extended to residents in Scotland who do not have a long-term right to remain here. Conversely, a lifelong resident of Scotland who is living away from home for a period of work or education is, by the arguments deployed by the Scottish Government, no longer considered to have a stake in our society. If the franchise is to be used in the same way for referendums, the issue can become even more pointed. If we look, for example, to Ireland, where there has been its distinction drawn between general elections and referendums, in a referendum, further restrictions are applied, acknowledging that Irish citizens have a closer tie to the Irish state. These issues are in part addressed by the additional limitation the bill proposes for residency in relation to election candidates. But there is a wider point, if I'd just like to make a bit of progress, please. But there is a wider point. Citizenship is a legal relationship that binds an individual with the state. It's not about origins or ethnicity. It's about a participation in a shared common endeavour. There is still some value to that relationship. That is based on more than simply the technical aspects of right to reside within a country's borders. Part 2 of the bill concerns the Scottish Government's proposals around prisoner voting. The legal questions around a ban on prisoner voting have existed since the 2005 decision of the European Court of Human Rights in the Hurst No. 2 case. But we know that a wide margin of appreciation exists in terms of how domestic law implements the requirements of Protocol 1 of the Convention, concerned with free and fair elections. The Scottish Government has previously suggested it has a moral opposition to prisoner voting. There is, however, a strong case that the bill presented here goes beyond the legal requirements of the European Convention and the decision of the European Court. On this side of the chamber, we have been consistent in our opposition to prisoner voting. Scottish Conservative members of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee opposed broadening the franchise in this way when it was looked at previously. When the issues have arisen in the UK Parliament, the UK Government's approach has been to outline a solution where a relatively small number of people in prison for offences, but released on temporary licence, will be able to vote. Temporary licence is a quite different state to imprisonment. These are people who, despite their offences, are being prepared for full resettlement into the community and beginning a clear process of rebuilding their lives outside of prison. It is a phase of their sentence that is entirely focused on rehabilitation. The UK Government's proposals have been welcomed and accepted by the Council of Europe as being an acceptable solution to the issues raised by the Hurst case. The Scottish Government's approach in the bill, however, is to provide voting rights to those serving sentences of 12 months or less. This goes far further and brings elections directly into our prisons. There are, of course, those who suggest that we should go even further, that the requirements of the Convention rights are a minimal standard in this area, and perhaps even that all restrictions on prisoner voting should be lifted entirely. To that, I echo the sentiment of the former Prime Minister David Cameron, who said that the idea of the consequences that flow from that made him physically sick. But that is admittedly not the situation that we are facing today. The presumption... Yes, I will.
Neil Findlay.
I have to say, given the policy agenda of Mr Cameron, he makes many people physically sick.
A bit more respect from members, I think. Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Well, I thank the member for that extraordinarily helpful and positive and productive comment, which I will gloss over. But that is admittedly not the situation that we're facing here today. The presumption in terms of the 12-month figure seems to be that those convicted in such a way will be the least serious offenders. The bill's policy memorandum sets out the distinction between the sentencing powers of courts acting by summary and solemn procedure. However, we know that the sentencing decisions are far from that clear-cut. With a range of options available to the courts, all custodial sentences are already a serious penalty, handed down for serious reasons. There is already a high bar for offenders to reach before they find themselves in prison. That in itself is enough to make me doubt the logic of opposing a ban on prisoner voting on the grounds of proportionality. Yes.
On this point, if the member wishes to look at inconsistencies, will he look at the decision in the rest of the UK, which means that any prisoner on temporary release can be entitled to vote, and there is no indication of the seriousness of the crime in terms of that at all. So it is perfectly possible that somebody convicted of a very serious crime south of the border will be on temporary release and eligible to vote. So if you're looking for consistency, if the member's looking for consistency, perhaps he should look to Scotland rather than to the rest of the UK.
Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Well, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention, but the point here is that these people are not in prison. And the bill, as it's proposed here, they are. In terms of the nature of offences, the Scottish Government's proposals to open up prisoner voting have also been a blanket approach. There has been, however, for example, no separate consideration of the case of people in prison for electoral offences. This arose in committee and received a response from the Cabinet Secretary. In his reply, however, he attempted to draw a false distinction, arguing that if crimes such as murder were to be treated the same, so should acts of electoral fraud. But this is to make a distinction of levels of seriousness, not one of type. And electoral offences are quite clearly relevant in these situations. We should also consider some of the consequences of politicians being obligated to consider the votes of offenders currently imprisoned. To what level would candidates be expected to engage with prisoners? What about those candidates and campaigners who are themselves victims of crime? I expect ministers may hide behind a defence that voting will form part of the prisoner's rehabilitation and reintegration into society. But we know from the Scottish Prison Service's own figures that the numbers of hours of work and education undertaken by prisoners has slumped in the last decade. Without real effort being put into rehabilitation, this is, at best, warm words. Presiding Officer, these are issues of unusual, effectively constitutional significance. So when prisoner voting was foisted upon us in the Shetland by-election by ministerial diktat, bypassing the scrutiny of this Parliament until after the event, it should rightly have been seen as an area of real concern. Now the Scottish Government's bill creates a framework for a fundamental change in the franchise. It is right that it receives tough scrutiny in this chamber. The committee's report raises a number of important questions about the bill going forward. Along with my colleagues on these benches, I've gone further than the report, and I believe there are very basic questions about the policies being pursued in this bill. We can improve how our elections are run and do much more to make them a better representation of the views of the electorate. We must work hard to make sure the votes are counted effectively and that efforts to combat electoral fraud are prioritised. And we must ensure that everyone who is legally entitled to vote not only can, but is encouraged to use their ballot. This bill does little to achieve those objectives.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Alec Rowley to open for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to open the debate for Labour today and would like to commend the committee for the Stage 1 report on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. We welcome the committee's conclusions and recommendations and believe the direction taken is one which will strengthen and improve the administration of devolved elections here in Scotland. The intention of the bill to ensure that citizens of all countries who are legally resident in Scotland are able to vote and stand in elections which affect them is one that we welcome. Foreign nationals who make their homes here in Scotland contribute greatly to our society, and it is only right that those who are legally resident in Scotland should be able to have a say on the decisions that affect their daily lives. It is heartening to see that the Scottish Government consultation on this extension of the voting franchise was supported by 79% of respondents, as well as being supported by those that provide the evidence to the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee as it scrutinised the bill. As the Scottish Refugee Council noted in their evidence, the proposed legislation addresses a long-standing democratic deficit whereby long-term residents in Scotland do not have a say on the areas that matter to them. I welcome that this is being addressed by this bill. Increasing participation in elections by encouraging people to vote and stand for election should be a key priority for any well-functioning democracy. And it is welcome to see Scotland take measures which allows more people who live, work and make their homes here in Scotland be given a right to vote, certainly.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm grateful to Mr Raleigh for taking the invitation. I want to ask him the same question that I asked the Minister. I mean, I completely understand the argument that the franchise should be connected to residency. But what is being lost in that argument is the sense that the franchise should be connected not simply to residency, but to citizenship. So the question I have is, what's left? What work is left for citizenship to do? If it doesn't give us the right to vote, what is its value in the modern world? Are we giving up on the idea of citizenship? Because it seems to me that it's premature to move as quickly as the government wants us to move to equate the franchise to residency, because it seems to me that there is something of value of citizenship that I want to conserve or preserve. I just wonder if Mr Rowley has any reflections on that.
Alex Rowley.
Well, Neil Finlay just mentioned to me there, no taxation without representation, and people are paying their taxes and living in this country, contributing to this country. I noticed that the Cabinet Secretary said to you didn't want to enter into a discussion on an essay about citizenship, but it's a valid discussion to have, and I'm happy to continue that discussion with Professor Tompkins as we move through this bill. It is also vitally important to make sure that the rights currently held by EU nationals living in Scotland are protected in the event of the UK leaving the EU. So I welcome this safeguard being put in place by ensuring voting rights are guaranteed based on residency status, which means the currently held voting rights of EU citizens would be reaffirmed in all scenarios at this uncertain time. Concerns were raised by the committee over the high numbers of people who are eligible to vote but who are not on the electoral register, as well as the number of people who are not correctly registered. The integrity of the register must be looked at and kept to the highest standard, and I would ask the Scottish Government to consider what moves can be taken to help ensure the register of local government electors is as complete and accurate as possible, especially given we are taking steps to extend the franchise within this bill. While these moves to extend voting rights are welcome, it is clear from witnesses to the committee that this must also come alongside voter education. We cannot simply enfranchise voters without also making sure they have the required information to make an informed decision and have a good understanding of the voting processes, including making sure that this is accessible to people. I note that the Cabinet Secretary has committed to promote engagement with the Scottish Refugee Council and other organisations working at the local level and across Scotland with the finance and resources required, but it would be helpful to have a clearer picture on how much support is required and if the necessary levels of financing will be provided, and that this is not just a simple tokenistic gesture. If we are going to follow through with the aims of this bill, then proper resourcing is required to ensure that those aims are met. With regard to the question of prisoner voting, I concur with the view put forward by the committee. It is essential that policy on prisoner voting is driven by principle and evidence. The Scottish Government has full control over legislating in relation to prisoner voting in devolved elections. It is clear that the current blanket ban on prisoner voting is unsustainable, particularly given that it leaves us open as a country at odds with the European Convention on Human Rights. As pointed out by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice research, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Switzerland and Ireland all have no electoral ban on prisoners being able to vote. We should look at the evidence from these countries to see what lessons can be learned here in Scotland. The Stage 1 report from the committee notes its view that the Scottish Government has settled on an approach which fails to address the central question of what disenfranchisement seeks to achieve. It is vital that we look at this and find an approach, as the committee say, that is driven by principle and evidence. Reform in this area is badly needed, so we need to move forward on that way, if I've got time. Yeah.
Liam Kerr.
The other countries that the member mentions as having had this, is there any evidential basis from those countries that there is an improvement in rehabilitation outcomes?
Alec Rowley.
Well, I don't know. That's the point I'm making. Given that these countries have this policy in place, that's what we need to look at the evidence. I haven't personally looked at that evidence as yet, but as we progress with this bill, and I do hear some members saying that there is evidence, but that's what we need to look at. It is vital that we do look at that evidence as the reform is needed. The central elements of this bill aside, voter registration and participation in Scotland is still too low. It is clear we must do more to address this, and I would call on the Scottish Government to provide more details on how, aside from the positive elements of this bill, it will promote greater participation in elections across Scotland. Our democratic processes have been pushed to their very limits over the past number of years, and it has left many across the country even questioning democracy itself. We must reaffirm faith in our democracy by strengthening it in any way that we can and bring back the trust that has been lost by showing people the choices are indeed in their hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Mark Ruskell to open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I join the convener in thanking the clerk, Spice, and all those who gave evidence on this bill at stage one. And can I also thank colleagues, because despite our very differing starting points, we did manage to find some consensus on many of the key areas in the bill, while agreeing to amicably disagree on other areas. Now, I acknowledge and welcome that basic compliance with the European Convention on Human Rights is a legal duty that the bill delivers. Although it is disappointing, quite chilling to hear the Tories suggest that democracy in some way isn't a human right. It is a human right, and it is there in the European Convention of Human Rights. But there are important issues around... Yeah, certainly.
Adam Tompkins.
Could you point me to the provision of the European Convention on Human Rights that confers a right to vote on anybody, never mind the right to vote on prisoners? There is no provision of the European Convention on Human Rights that includes the phrase right to vote. That's the point that was being made from these benches, and it's accurate and true.
Mark Ruskell.
Okay, well, I think we're dancing on the head of a pin here, because under the Convention of Human Rights, Article 3 is the right to free elections, of which Protocol 1, number 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights. You cannot have elections, Mr. Tompkins, unless you have people freely being allowed to vote in those elections and indeed to stand in those elections as well. But there are, of course, important issues around the extension of the franchise to asylum seekers and young people, and the need for more widespread prisoner voting to assist rehabilitation, which this bill does not yet fully address. And I welcome the openness from the Cabinet Secretary to work with myself and indeed other members in seeking to complete the powers within this bill. Because the Scotland that we're proud of is inclusive. Just pull up a chair and you're in. That's what citizenship means to me. So guaranteeing the rights of EU citizens and other foreign nationals to vote and stand for election is a necessary and welcome step in this bill. I recently hosted 2 well-attended events in Stirling and St Andrews for EU citizens concerned about their rights. And what struck me was their commitment to Scotland and their communities. These people are us, they're not others. And the settled status scheme, quite frankly, is an insult to citizens who've chosen to spend their lives here. And I was moved at these events, in particular, talking to pensioners who've been in Scotland longer than some of us have even been alive. They were confused and hurt about settled status scheme. They deserve better. They deserve representation. And to be honest, they deserve the right to represent all of us as well, should they choose to stand for election. But what really moved me in the consideration of this bill was the informal session that the committee hosted with the Scottish Refugee Council. And the convener has already articulated to the Chamber many of the powerful quotes that came from members who came along to that. And we met this wonderful group of asylum seekers, individuals who've made their legal application for leave to remain, and in most cases have been here for many, many years. They were eloquent and passionate about democracy. They were passionate about local services. We had an in-depth debate about potholes. And to be honest, these are the people that I would certainly like to vote for as my councillors. And perhaps many of these people should be sat here as MSPs as well. Now, there are, of course, considerations about whether an asylum seeker's status may change should they be elected to office. But as we see by the number of council by-elections that are triggered each year, it's already the case that personal circumstances can and will change. And I think especially for councillors where health or wider employment issues arise. Now, that's a personal consideration that individuals standing for election and their parties make when they decide to put themselves forward for nomination. Now, I know the Cabinet Secretary is concerned about the complexities surrounding electoral registration of asylum seekers, and there are issues with this bill based on qualification on the 1971 Immigration Act. But where there is a will, there's a way, and I believe the Cabinet Secretary does want to find a way forward on this. And with the clock now ticking on stage 2, I want to find that way with him to bring these people into the franchise. Because these people are citizens in everything but name. Asylum seekers are not tourists. They have a lawful presence under immigration bail. They're issued with a photo ID asylum registration card. And in many ways, they're able to prove their habitual residence in a more detailed way than the rest of us who simply self-declare on a registration form. And it's not enough to say that asylum seekers can already make representation to elected members for issues that concern them. That's not enough. You know, they live here. We walk together on the same streets, and they deserve democratic participation, not just representation. On prisoner voting, the government does need to be clear what it is trying to achieve beyond mere legal compliance and a compromise to minimise public controversy. One important principle here is about rehabilitation rather than punishment. I mean, to be honest, it's no punishment to deny a prisoner the opportunity to vote for me or any other MSP in this chamber. But as offenders work through their sentences, the work to rehabilitate has to meaningfully progress. To reintegrate offenders back into society, they have to be educated to understand the needs of others, to build empathy, to feel part of a wider society, rather than a narrow peer group of fellow prisoners. Voting in an election is just one strand of an approach to build that sense of social responsibility. But drawing a line at one-year sentences for the termination of voting rights does appear really arbitrary in this bill. And I'm sure at stage 2 there will be a range of options presented for increasing the franchise further. And I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to be bold. The principle of prisoner voting has been agreed. The government has already taken a hit to an extent from the right wing. It should now make the extension of the franchise meaningful and purposeful as well as just legal. The recent extension of the electoral franchise to young people has been a great acknowledgement of their rights and contribution to society. And the climate strikes have underlined this even further. And for me personally, the sight of class loads of young people in their school uniforms going out to vote is an absolutely wonderful thing. But it does beg the question over whether voting and candidacy rights should be equalised at some point. Now, I realise it's an area that requires careful consideration, particularly around safeguarding issues, but I see no fundamental reasons why young people cannot and should not take their place as decision makers. If political parties feel a young person is mature enough to hold office, then the ability to select that person to stand should be available. And I invite the Cabinet Secretary to consider how this could be explored further before what I think will probably be a very busy stage 2 and stage 3 process with this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Alex Cole-Hamilton to open for the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure to speak on behalf of my party in this Stage 1 debate and to offer the support of the Liberal Democrats to the principles of this bill. This bill includes a variety of improvements to the way in which people in Scotland can vote and be represented. And Scottish Liberal Democrats have been calling for many of these changes for a very long time. I pay tribute to my colleagues and predecessors who've all worked very hard to make those arguments, even when at times they were not easy arguments to make and were sometimes met with hostility. Presiding Officer, Rousseau said in the social contract that people are only truly free during the election of members of Parliament, and the ability to cast a ballot is an opportunity for change. It should be always about letting people make a meaningful choice and have their voices heard. At a time when more and more people see politics as a frustration instead of an opportunity, it is more important than ever that we engage with the people. We have to make it easier, not harder, for them to influence the way in which our country is run. It is part of how we build an inclusive, compassionate and liberal society. But part of the way in which we build that liberal society is the way in which we treat offenders. And I welcome very much the provisions in this bill to recognise the need to extend the franchise to people who are incarcerated. The blanket ban on prisoner voting that currently applies means that we have knowingly been in breach of the European Convention on Human Rights since 2005. The Conservatives ask throughout this debate where it is written in the Convention on Human Rights, but it is in case precedent, legal precedent set out in the Hearst judgment that means there is a legal imperative for us as a country to extend the franchise to people in our prisons. There is no corollary between a crime, a sentence, and the removal of the right to vote. If you were sentenced to prison in 2011 for 3 years, you would have missed 2 electoral tests. If you'd committed the same crime and were sentenced for 3 years in 2014, you would have missed 9 electoral tests. It's entirely arbitrary and bears no relation to either the crime or the intent of the punishment. And so it was that when the Equalities and Human Rights Committee, which I am vice convener, looked at this last year, the evidence for change was direct and it was compelling. And so we welcome the change at the heart of this bill that this represents. And whilst I recognise it's a step forward, again I agree with Mark Ruskell that just extending it to short-term one-year sentences does not actually answer the legal imperative. And it does, I think, still continue that very arbitrary nature of who is allowed to vote and who does not, because the arguments stand on their own. I hope this chamber will recognise that the hard work that preceded this bill to ensure that change, and it has been a long and hard-won battle, even before the days of the Hearst judgment. Liberal Democrats tabled amendments to bills that would have given some prisoners, based on sentence length, the vote in both the independence referendum and the last election to the Scottish Parliament. Both were voted down by this government. We put forward those amendments because stopping prisoners from voting isn't legal, it's not fair, and it's not progressive. Allowing those on short-term sentences, as this bill will do, to have their say means that finally their imminent rehabilitation can be done with a greater sense of inclusion in our society. Ensuring that prisoners are prepared to rejoin our communities, making them more aware of the responsibilities of citizenship, means the chance of reintegration is higher and the chance of recidivism is reduced. The evidence says that they are amongst the most disengaged, so why not help them to realise these rights? This will benefit their communities they are returning to as well. Can I welcome, presiding officer, provision within the bill around EU citizens? 50 years ago, 18-year-olds were finally given the vote in the United Kingdom. Before then, only those over the age of 21 had the right. It seems almost unbelievable that it took that long. 18-year-olds had gone to war for this country. They had paid taxes. They contributed to establishing the NHS. They'd been marrying and having families, and yet it took until the 1960s for them to receive the vote. In 2019, that same kind of disenfranchisement still exists as regards EU citizens. We are heavily indebted to people who choose to make Scotland their home. They deserve the warmest of welcomes. Immigration is good for Scotland, just like it is good for the rest of the UK. Yet despite this, they are denied the ability to participate fully in civic life because they cannot vote. It is the least that we can do in exchange for their caring for older people, teaching our children and saving lives in our hospitals to allow them that franchise. Scottish Liberal Democrats are internationalists, that's no secret. We welcome the enormous contributions that EU citizens bring to our communities, our culture and our economy. Those who choose to come to the UK to work or to study or join our families should be welcomed for the skills and contributions that they bring. And I am glad that this bill seeks to extend the franchise for Scottish elections to people who have sought refugee protection as well. I think that point was put very succinctly in a contribution to the Scottish Youth Parliament when an MSYP said, if you live here, you contribute and you should have a say. It should be that simple. People in Scotland should have every right to have a say in the decisions that affect them. And I hope that through the course of this bill, we will make changes that will, in the next 100 or 50 years, seem just as common sense as extending the right to women and to 18-year-olds to vote. I wanted also to say, in terms of young people, and I fundamentally absolutely agree with the Green Party position here, that if we trust young people to have a say in the governance of this country, then we should trust them also to put themselves forward as candidates for elected office, and we should support them to do so. They are our future, and they deserve to have a voice in that future. We're happy to confirm the Liberal Democrat support for this bill tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move now to our opening debate, and I call on Maureen Watt to be followed by Liam Kerr. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm pleased to be taking part in the Stage 1 debate on the Scottish Elections, Franchise and Representations Bill. I don't think it's often that the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee consider bills, but like buses, there are often none, and now we have two in quick succession, with us currently taking evidence on the Scottish Elections Reform Bill. Presiding Officer, as others have already said, there's nothing more important in a democracy than ensuring that as many people living and working in our country have the right to vote and participate in elections. The old maxim, as Alec Rowley and maybe from Neil Finlay said, no taxation without representation should never be forgotten. So it's really important that one of the key tenets of the bill is to seek to ensure that an electoral system supports and empowers the engagement in elections of all those who have chosen to make Scotland their home, and that we should create the conditions which encourage people not only to vote, but to consider standing for election. We live in a world with an increasingly mobile global population, and as International IDA observed, this has prompted many countries to reconsider the link between citizenship and voting rights, to address democratic deficits and to support the social and political integration of citizens. In many different debates and committees in this Parliament, we recognise the needs of the Scottish economy to have people from other countries to come and work and make their home in Scotland. And therefore, as valued contributors to our society, they should have a say in the laws that govern us all. And whether that was Just Right Scotland, the Scottish Refugee Council, the Church and Society Council of the Church of Scotland, Maryhill Integration Network, all of these organisations recognise the valuable and valued contribution of New Scots and how participation in the electoral process is important to integration. Currently, some by their nationality do qualify to vote and stand in elections. EU citizens and qualifying Commonwealth citizens, for example. But the proposals in this bill will allow all persons of all nationalities legally resident in Scotland to vote in Scottish Parliament and local government elections. This is estimated to allow around 55,000 new citizens to vote and stand for election. What will therefore be important is to inform these citizens of their new enfranchisement. And some concern was voiced about whether the resources allocated to the new voter education are sufficient. We have to recognise that there are many who will come from regimes where there is a great distrust of their political system, and some reassurance will be necessary. So I would like the Cabinet Secretary to assure me and others that the resources allocated for this work are proportionate, and also that they will be shared appropriately among different organisations across Scotland. For example, I would like to see those who run our colourful and vibrant Mellas in Aberdeen and across Scotland being able to access some of the money so that through peer support and at the Mellas, they can increase voter registration and encourage participation. While, as some have already said, on the one hand, some are Scots who are fearful of authority, others celebrate their new lives and new freedoms and are very engaged in civic society in Scotland. No one more so were the young people, the young asylum seekers who came to meet the SPPA committee informally through the auspices of the Scottish Refugee Council. They were desperate to play a full part in Scottish life. The committee welcomes the bill's intention to extend the franchise to those who have been granted leave to remain, which is normally for a period of 5 years. But unfortunately, under the current UK government system, there are still far too many asylum seekers waiting for far too long for their status to be confirmed. And it is with deep regret that we have to wait for full control of immigration to come to this Parliament before we can meet the ambitions of these young people. Presiding Officer, I'd now like to turn briefly to prisoner voting. And I should perhaps declare that before entering this place in 2006, I was for 12 years prior to that a member of a prison visiting committee and was a frequent visitor to the old former Craiginches prison and other penal establishments in Scotland. It's important to recognise that the effect of the Scotland Act 1998 setting up this place and the Human Rights Act 1998 require all public authorities in Scotland, including this government and Parliament, to act in accordance with the European Convention on Human Rights. In our evidence, both orally in front of the committee and written, there was an overwhelming desire, I think, to allow a move towards allowing those to vote with a prison sentence of 4 years or less. And I do personally think there's a contradiction between a presumption against short sentences of a year or less and setting the level at 1 year. But I'm sure this will be teased out during the future stages of the bill. There was, however, broad agreement that infringement should not be at the discretion of the sentencing judge or the types of crime committed or whether the crime committed was electoral fraud. But, Presiding Officer, as I said, I do look forward to the further stages of this bill and that the Parliament approve stage 1 of this bill tonight.
Thank you very much. And I call on Liam Kerr to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I cannot vote for the principles of this franchise bill at stage 1 this evening. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson articulated my concerns in the generality, but for me, I cannot get beyond the prisoner voting aspect, which would allow those convicted of a crime severe enough to warrant a prison sentence being allowed to play a part in determining the outcome of Holyrood and Council elections. Historically, the position has been that those convicted of a crime severe enough to warrant a prison sentence lose some of their rights as a function of that imprisonment, including the right to vote. And several reasons have been advanced today to alter that position. Firstly, the Cabinet Secretary raised that rehabilitation prospects are increased by giving prisoners the right to vote on the premise that participating in elections is likely to encourage them to become responsible, law-abiding citizens through, I think he said, active citizenship. Presiding Officer, I don't see it. Alex Rowley is right. Policy should be driven by evidence, and I do not see the evidential base which links the exercise of the franchise to greater rehabilitation in the reports, not least because Bill Kidd conceded that his committee felt that such small numbers would avail themselves that it would have no impact whatsoever. And I don't see it. Yes, Mr. Stevenson.
Mr. Stevenson.
Does the member accept that the penal system operating in this country, and indeed south of the border in the UK, leading to the greatest number of prisoners in our prisons, and the relatively ineffective rehabilitation that is derived from that, stands in stark contrast to countries, and I only pick one at random, such as Sweden, where almost all the citizens' rights are retained during periods of incarceration, and the outcomes are incomparably better, and fewer discharged prisoners return to prison.
Liam Kerr.
Thank the member for the intervention. My point was absolutely clear. What we need is an evidential basis for rehabilitation. And in the report, there is no such evidential basis. Indeed, what we have is language such as it may potentially add to the sense of alienation that may not help. There is assertion that enfranchisement is potentially an opportunity for education, which, of course, as we know, and I'll turn to in a second, prisoners are currently not getting. And I read that as a concession that education is the key here, not the franchise. Presiding Officer, I don't see the evidence when I read the Audit Scotland report, reducing reoffending in Scotland. What I do see, when I have visited prisons and prisoners, when I have interrogated these reports, and when committees in this Parliament have exhaustively pored over evidence regarding rehabilitation, is that what improves rehabilitation are things like education, purposeful work, a job to return to, a house to live in, a meaningful family contact during incarceration. And that means it would be far better when considering rehabilitation and how to spend resources, were Parliament to exercise its time to addressing the fact that the number of hours of work and education carried out by Scotland's prisoners dropped by nearly 300,000 in 2017-18. Yes, Mr Finlay.
Neil Finlay.
If he thinks it's not about rehabilitation, then he must think it's about punishment and prevention. Therefore, has he got any evidence that that approach works? Does he know anyone who said, I was going to commit that crime, but I was really terrified they would take my vote away from me?
Liam Kerr.
I think the report actually picks that point up, that people are not put off because they're going to lose the right to vote, but I don't think that's relevant to the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that rehabilitation is best served by the provision of work in prisons and education, and of course, the inability that we see now, due to Scottish Government actions, for the SPS to provide a through care service. And to ensuring, and I think Mr Finlay will agree with me on this, that resource and time should be used to end the current necessity for shared cells, for example, because that is what's going to have a greater impact on human rights and rehabilitation prospects than the extension of the franchise. Now, many members may be with me on this, but feel constrained by the human rights argument, in which regard it is worth noting at the outset that the ECHR was carefully worded at Article 3 of Protocol 1 to include a duty on governments to hold elections. It did not specifically accord an individual right for prisoners to vote. And that makes sense, because when one is punished for a crime by imprisonment, one has certain rights curtailed, chiefly the rights to freedom and privacy. One also loses the right to vote. And the fact that a right for prisoners to vote neither features, I really won't because I'm running late, Mr Russell, I do apologise. If it's very quick, please, Cabinet Secretary.
With Article 3 of Protocol 1, does he disagree with the court, which said in the case of Hertz, the right to vote is not a privilege? In the 21st century, the presumption of a democratic state must be in favour of inclusion. There is no room in the Convention for the old idea of civic death that lies behind the ban on convicted prisoners voting. That is the court on Hurst.
I say to the Cabinet Secretary, first of all, that Adam Tompkins, my colleague, will address that point in closing. But remember, this was a right. The Hurst case took 23 years to find that right from when the ECHR was brought in. And I think Mr Tompkins will elaborate on that later. The fact that the right for prisoners to vote neither features in the Convention nor was intended to by its architects suggests that actually what we are debating today is as much an issue of social policy. This is supported by the wide variation in interpretation of what the right is and to whom it is applied. A minority of European Union countries give all prisoners the vote, and plenty of democratic countries retain full bans. And indeed, the Law Society briefing makes clear the franchise of prisoners may be restricted, providing that the restriction is proportionate to achieving a legitimate aim, such as enhancing civic responsibility, respect for the rule of law, and avoiding sanctioning law-breaking conduct. That being the case, the Scottish Government is not mandated to enfranchise this category of prisoners at all, and could find it is compliant merely to enfranchise those on temporary licence. Now, if the Chamber is not with me so far, members will surely accept that this is only a qualified right, as opposed to absolute rights enjoyed by all, such as the right not to be subjected to torture. And if that's the case, it inexorably follows that we must consider more than just the rights of prisoners, because the people watching, the victims, those who suffered serious assault, attempted murder, sexual assault, crimes which have in the last few years attracted sentences of 12 months or less, will be watching this and saying, where were my human rights? What happened to my right to freedom from discrimination, my right to security, my right not to suffer inhuman or degrading treatment? We need to be under no illusions, presiding officer. Those sentenced to 12 months imprisonment are, by definition, serious criminals. The more serious offences which defeated the presumption against short sentences and the desire to give community disposals. Those criminals not suitable for electronic monitoring. The repeat offenders. And where all that gets you to, presiding officer, is that when I walk out of this chamber after decision time tonight and look victims in the eye and the relatives of those whose right to life was offended, whose right to freedom from torture was offended, and they say, why does the Scottish Parliament put a prisoner's qualified right to vote over my family's absolute right to life? I must answer, I did not. And for that reason, I cannot vote for the principles of this bill tonight. And I strongly encourage colleagues across the chamber to think very carefully about the message that they will send tonight if they disagree. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Stuart McMillan to be followed by James Kelly. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I do support the general aims of this bill, and I commend the report from colleagues also on the Standards Committee. I wish to deal with the aspects of the report at the outset before tying the report into just a wider issue just towards the end. And the bill continues Scotland's strong record of electoral reform and demonstrates the commitment to value equally everyone who chooses to make Scotland their home. The conclusions and the recommendation section of the report, I believe, is very helpful in actually bringing out the key points from the report. But I'm going to touch upon some of the paragraphs of the report from the committee. I agree with extending the franchise to foreign nationals living in Scotland, paragraph 16. For me, the situation is very much crystal clear. If someone chooses to live their life here, contribute to our society, contribute to our economy, and become part of their community, then why should they be denied a say in how Scotland and their community is run? Also, why should they be considered to be an outcast in their own community? Telling people that their voice doesn't matter by denying them a vote, in my opinion, is very much narrow British nationalism at its worst. I'm appalled that the Tories don't want this to happen, and I hope that they do rethink the position on this particular issue, because I believe that their position is just very much untenable. They may argue that the policy is not unique and that many other countries deny foreign nationals the vote. Now, that may well be the case, and it will be the case, but I believe that it ill behoves this Parliament and this country to follow in those footsteps. Sometimes in life, it's actually better to lead the way as compared to meekly following others. And this aspect of the bill, in my opinion, sets out the stall to tell all foreign nationals with indefinite right to remain that they matter to Scotland. Scotland has already led the way by lowering the voting age to 16, and these provisions in the bill take further strides to create an even more inclusive franchise. Now, we are the home of the Enlightenment, yet some in this chamber don't want to be enlightened when it comes to foreign nationals living here. I also agree with the report in paragraphs 23, 34 and 42 in this area of discussion around the franchise. And I particularly want to comment on paragraph 43. Now, well done to the committee, and shame on the Tories in this. Now, people who have left Scotland to forge a life elsewhere should, in my opinion, have no say as to how Scotland is run now. Why should they? They have chosen not to live here for whatever reason, then they should actually forfeit the right to potentially affect the running of the country. Now, there will be people who do live here, who have got contracts, who work elsewhere. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson touched upon some of this earlier on. Now, there will be people who work in the oil and gas sector, but their home is here, so they will not be adversely affected. They will still have their right to vote here, and quite rightly so. I welcome the recommendation and the comments from the Cabinet Secretary today regarding asylum seekers, that's regarding paragraph 51 of the report. I accept it's a different argument for voting entitlement, but I do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's approach to examine if this matter can be progressed further. On the issue of candidacy rights, I welcome the recommendations at 67 and also 68. As I've stated in this chamber before, Scotland's tartan is a mix of colours and backgrounds. It's not just white with a ginger fringe. That more candidates from differing backgrounds and nationalities makes our country and our society stronger. Anyone in the chamber at the time of Christian Allard and Marco Biaggi stating their oaths in both French and Italian respectively would accept that that was a privilege to actually be in the chamber at that time. And I think, and I believe, we have more people from different backgrounds standing for this Parliament and also for local authorities, then I also believe that, that our community, our society and our country will be better for it when we have more people from different backgrounds elected to the various chambers. Extending the candidacy rights for those with indefinite rights to remain, in my opinion, is very much a measure that can only make Scotland stronger and a better country for it. I also, thank you. I also support the recommendation of allowing those serving under 12 months the right to vote. Very few people would actually be enfranchised, as Bill Kidd spoke of earlier on, but I do believe it's a progressive step forward. But I note that Liam Kerr in his comments indicated, and I can't remember your full quote, but he indicated that this will only be a small number, it might not make a difference. Well, I'm actually standing here beside Bill Kidd, who won his seat by 7 votes. Every single vote counts. And Stephen Gethins, who won his seat by 2 votes. Every single vote counts. So I genuinely believe it will be a progressive step going forward. I note the recommendation from the committee, so clearly this is very much an area that more discussion does need to happen around. Now, Jamie Halcrow-Johnson spoke earlier about the barriers to political participation, and there are many, and that's a point that we will both agree on. However, the actions of politicians and political parties can also help with the issue of political engagement. Politicians are quite right to highlight trolling and abuse that they get, particularly female politicians. Today's report in the BBC actually highlights 4 such female politicians from across the political spectrum. We are also, at the moment, in the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence period, and all of us will wholeheartedly support the campaign. So with that in mind, would Jamie Halcrow-Johnson therefore condemn his colleague Ruth Davidson and her ill-considered tweet this week about the First Minister getting a doing? Now, political engagement and encouraging voters should be done positively without using that type of language. So I do support the principles of this bill. I do thank the Standards Committee for their excellent report, and I look forward to the rest of this debate and also this bill progressing through Parliament so our country can become a more progressive country and also a more politically engaged country with more people in the society. Thank you very much.
James Kelly, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to take part in this afternoon's debate, supporting the general principles of the bill. I want, like others, to start by thanking the committee for their considerations of some very important issues here. There's obviously been a number of themes already running through the debate this afternoon. In relation to the position on foreign nationals, it's been interesting to listen to the various exchanges across the chamber, mainly involving Adam Tompkins, about the issue of whether people who reside in this country should then be entitled to vote, and what that places the rights in terms of citizenship. I mean, I think you can have an intellectual discussion back and forward about that, but looking at it logically, for me, people who reside here from other countries, but who bring up their family here, are part of the community, who potentially work in employment and pay taxes, I think are therefore have a right to participate in elections that are going to set the laws of the country by which they will have to abide and live and respect by. I think that's a fairly logical position. The other probably major debate that's come up as a result of the legislation is around prisoner voting. When the Parliament last examined prisoner voting ahead of the 2014 referendum, it took a position not to include prisoners in the franchise for that referendum. I think it's right that it should be re-examined at this time. The reality is that the Hurst case, the judgment took place in 2005, so we're now some 14 years down the line. Obviously, the driver for this to be examined are the new powers that have come into the Scottish Parliament in relation to the franchise for local government and the Scottish Parliament elections. But I think the government are right to have a regard to complying with the outcome of that case in terms of ECHR Article 3. And that's part of the reason for looking at the change. I think in addition to that, having thought about this carefully as someone that was involved in the 2013 decision that the Parliament took, I think there is a case for looking at rehabilitation. There's been a lot of debates in recent times about the crisis in the prison system and the fact that the prison population is 8,300. Sometimes it rises higher than that. It's almost at full capacity. And we do need to look at the serious issue of rehabilitation. I do think that if you give, in a proportionate way, prisoners the right to vote, then it does encourage them to be more responsible citizens. And just let me finish this point. And when they do re-enter the society and community, then there's a better chance of them not re-offending. And that is good for that citizen, and it's good for society as a whole. And it also takes the pressure off the overpopulation in the prison system. Mr. Kerr.
Liam Kerr.
Question, Mr. Kelly. What's your evidence base for that assertion?
James Kelly.
I think if you listen to all the debates that we've had, and I've participated in a number of these debates now in returning to the justice portfolio, that one of the drivers that we look at in terms of reducing prison population is reducing reoffending. And one of the ways of reducing reoffending is to ensure that people basically feel better about themselves, feel more part of society, feel that they're making more of a contribution. And one of the great ways of making a contribution is, and we see it all playing out before us in this election campaign is participating in the debates around the campaign and being able to vote. I think that helps people to become better citizens. I see it every day on the election campaign. So I think there has to be, it's fair to say that there's got to be a proportionate basis to this. I think the committee are right to ask the government to look at the evidence in terms of the different options between 12 months, ranging up to 4 years, and there can be further examination of this ahead of stage 3. I think some of the other important issues that need to be examined are those around electoral registration. I think it's a real concern that there can be up to 830,000 people missing from the electoral register. And going round canvassing, I do actually find in practical terms that that's the case, that there are a lot of people missing off the register. So it's important that we get the register updated as the committee recommended in the report. And linked to that, the committee also makes some important points about, in the financial memorandum, about funding for local government. If we're going to empower local government to extend the franchise, to improve voter education, and to ensure the accuracy of the electoral register, they need to be funded properly to do that. So, in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, there's been a number of important issues addressed in this report. I support the general principles of the bill and thank the committee for the work that they've carried out.
Stuart Stevenson, followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Looking at the franchise is the first issue. It opposed, starting with the 1832 Great Reform Act, or the first Reform Act, and the Scottish equivalent, which incidentally took the vote away from women who actually had the vote before that period. The Tories opposed. The Pittite faction had its fingerprints all over that. They also opposed the taking away of the property qualification. The Tories opposed that. The only time when the Tories had any momentary point of self-doubt was the 1922 election when Winston Churchill lost his seat in Dundee to a Scottish Prohibitionist party in a hangover from the pre-1832 provisions whereby boroughs elected multiple members and Dundee elected 2. You only had 1 vote, but you elected 2 members, and Winston Churchill came 3rd. He didn't think much of the system then. When my mother first got her right to vote, she had to wait till she was 30. And when she did get that right to vote, she had 2 votes because she was a university graduate. Every stage of the way, major changes have been resisted by the Tories. Plus ça change, plus ça même chose. Nothing changes. I will now that I've completed my point, Mr. Tompkins.
Adam Tompkins.
I'm excessively grateful to the member for taking an intervention. Surely in this wonderful and not entirely accurate history of Conservative franchise reform, he's not going to overlook the 1867 Act, which was premiered by Benjamin Disraeli, a Conservative Prime Minister, the biggest single increase in the franchise in the 19th century.
Correct, and indeed it led to the introduction of the first secret votes, because the doubling in the franchise that derived from the 3 acts that followed from that, because it wasn't 1 act, there were over 4 years period, there were a number of acts. The first secret franchise, which took place in August, if I recall correctly, and you talked about a by-election, but I'm slightly uncertain about that one. It's not in my notes, Mr. Tompkins, I do apologise. But the bottom line is, we've had a number of things about residency and so on and so forth. I think we need to be cautious about the idea of taking away the right to vote from residents who are citizens of other countries. Because, of course, and I have 3 family members to whom this applies, who are not resident in the UK, are resident in other countries, some in the EU and some elsewhere, who have the right to vote, even though they're not citizens of that country. We interfere with the rights of people in this country, I think you might see reciprocal action elsewhere. But that's speculation, not certainty, and I can't be certain. I very much support the provisions on qualification. Now, more fundamentally, I think, on the issue of prisons, I absolutely suggest that when a prisoner is in prison, being deprived of the liberty, that is both a punishment and it may well be a protection for society. But at the end of the day, in other jurisdictions, and I have a niece who's now a Swedish citizen because of Brexit, I'm particularly well informed on there, that you find that the better the connections that are retained between people who have to be deprived of their liberty and the possibility of resuming their life in a proper fashion after prison is enhanced by the number of civic connections that they have with a pre-existing life. Being able to retain their house, their residency, their connections to their family, and indeed the right to vote. It is not that there is a single measure makes a difference. It is the aggregation of all the measures that provide assistance. And we do know in our own jurisdiction that when we send someone to prison, we reduce the chances of their rehabilitation being effective, we increase the chance of their recidivism. So there is a more general point about that. Now, like others, I've considerable experience since coming here. I've attended 278 Justice Committee meetings. I've visited prisons, not been in prisons, in Scotland, Wales, in France, and in the Republic of Georgia in the Caucasus. Different jurisdictions do things in different ways. But the bottom line is that we've got to think about the practical effects. I support what we're trying to do. I do think there are a couple of things we can think about. The 12 months rule is a relatively arbitrary one, but it's simple to understand and it has that great merit. And we could tweak it if we think it should be another figure. I kind of thought it might be the difference between a summary procedure and a solemn procedure under which you might get convicted. But I think that would be actually more complicated. I think the bill at section 7.4, there's a wee difficulty I've got in my mind the way it's constructed, because it talks about the date of the election. But proxies, of course, can be postal proxies, so votes can be casted before the date of the election in a strict sense. And I think there's a wee drafting issue that it may be worth revisiting. Uninterrupted residence, it's possible to have multiple places of residence, as I, and perhaps some colleagues here do, both in my constituency and my house here. I'm not allowed to vote in the same election twice, but I'm allowed to be registered in the electoral register twice. I choose not to, I hasten to add. So I think there are wee issues around that as well. I strongly support provisions of this bill, not simply because of issues around ECHR or court cases, but simply because I think it is a modest and useful contribution to rehabilitating prisoners as they return to society, preventing the total disconnection that too much of the prison system does. And finally, can I congratulate Tom Fox, whom we all know as our connection with the SPS. He retires at 5 o'clock today.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Gil Patterson.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. It is indeed a pleasure to be involved in this very important debate, which will result in the introduction of sensible modifications to the existing UK legislation as they apply to Scotland. The Scottish Elections Franchise and Representations Bill is a worthy piece of legislation which demonstrates how, as a result of devolution, Scotland can take a different approach to major franchise issues from the remainder of the UK. In my view, Scottish Parliament elections and local government elections will be much more inclusive and will better reflect Scottish society's desire to be fair and not to exclude anyone living in Scotland from the voting process. I'm particularly interested in the voting by qualifying foreign nationals provisions. I have always believed that anyone who lives legally in Scotland should have the same voting rights, and we should not discriminate against anyone on the basis of the land of their birth. Most of Scotland agrees with an ageing population. Scotland requires foreign nationals, or as I very much prefer to say, new Scots, to help grow and sustain our economy. So we would want to encourage them to stay, integrate into our society and to belong to Scotland. Part of that belonging is equal rights, and an important part of equal rights is voting rights. So I'm very supportive of the bill's provisions, and I'm convinced that this legislation will encourage many of the young people and families currently living in Scotland to indeed stay. With regard to prisoners' voting rights, I have to say I think the provision in Part 2 of the bill are just about correct. And again, we will demonstrate our difference to the rest of the UK, in my view, who by providing a blanket ban on prisoners' voting rights have breached the European Convention of Human Rights, which was ruled unlawful by the European Court of Human Rights. This is unacceptable position. This unacceptable position will be put right in Scotland by this legislation, providing voting rights for prisoners who have sentences. Yes, certainly.
Liam Kerr.
Does the member not accept that it could be put right, as he puts it, by having the same temporary release qualification rather than the 12 months voting, as they have down south?
Gil Patterson.
No, actually I don't. I think it's a cop-out, to be quite frank with you, to not abide by the spirit of what's really should be determined by CHR. And I actually think that sometimes when I listen to Tory politicians, I think really have had a humanity bypass, to be quite honest with you. You should look at that even if there was no benefit in terms of rehabilitation. It's just how you would actually treat people. Providing rights voting is just how you would actually treat people. Providing voting rights for prisoners who have sentences of no more than 12 months seems to be sensible to have rehabilitation at its core. Additionally, most prisoners with short sentences are there because of fairly low-level crimes, and to extend the franchise to them will have the effect of including them in the mainstream society. This will hopefully reduce the chances of reoffending and will reduce our prison population. I've got to admit to having a kind of change with regard to 4 years. So having said that, it's my opinion that those who have been convicted for more serious crimes, particularly those of a sexual nature or violent crimes and crimes which harm people, have forfeited their right to vote. So I think the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representations Bills has been set at the correct level on both these issues, and therefore I support the passage of the bill. And in doing so, I would like to thank all the members of the committee for their solid work on in this regard. Thank you.
We now move to the closing speeches, and of course everyone who took part in the debate should be back in the chamber. And I call Neil Finlay for around 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the committee clerks and witnesses for their support and input throughout the initial stages of the bill. It has been an interesting bill at times, and we've heard some interesting contributions in the evidence that we've received on the extension of the franchise rights to foreign nationals. I think the majority of the committee supported the proposals to extend the franchise to those resident in Scotland and at the time of an election, and I agree with them on that. I think that principle that people have emphasised about people who live in Scotland and contribute to her country and society having the right to influence the politics and the elections to local government and Scottish Parliament elections, I think that is a right principle, and these bodies spend money and take decisions that affect people living here. So I think that is a sound principle. Maureen Watt and Alec Rowley mentioned the principle of no taxation without representation. It's an old principle, but it's one that stands to the test of time. I think we need to be sure, though, and there was a bit of questions in the committee about the number of people who would be added to the register. And I think we have to be absolutely clear on what the expected numbers are, so that electoral registration officers and others can be prepared for that increase. And while we want to widen democratic participation to foreign nationals, we should also be looking about expanding the number of people registering to vote, citizens in Scotland registering to vote across the board. We see at the moment, with the involvement of political parties, with councils, government, schools, colleges, youth groups and all manner of groups, have added around 3 million applications to the register in the run-up to the election, since the election was called. That's a very good thing. It shows what can be done to widen participation with the right approach. And I have to say that voter registration and voter education campaigns require resources and commitment and personnel. I know a number of youth workers, council youth workers, who were extremely skilled. Indeed, they were prize-winning projects they did with young people, young first-time voters, to get them on the register and educate them about their responsibilities. And many of those have gone in the massacre of personnel that has followed with all the cuts to local government. Councils have had to cut back on administration staff, communications professionals, advertising, and so much more. And it's inevitable that if the choice is between social care or education and voter registration, then we know what is going to fall off the edge. So we need capacity and resource to be put into voter registration if it's going to be have a significant impact. And if the government is serious about this, then it has to fund it with real money. But Bill Kidd and others... Yeah, of course.
Stuart McMillan.
Thank Neil Finlay for taking the intervention, but would Neil Finlay agree with me that, as the comments I mentioned earlier on regarding the political language that all politicians and parties actually use is extremely important as well in terms of engagement and getting more people to register?
Neil Finlay.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, politics is a robust business, and the language can get a bit fiery at times, and we've all been involved in that. But I think there is at times we see that going too far. Sorry, Bill Kidd referred to the meeting that we had with the group of men and women from the refugee community, and they were very keen to extend both voting and candidacy rights, and that was a very good and powerful meeting. Their evidence was excellent, and I think I agree with. I think it was Mark who mentioned that they would make excellent, very articulate in expressing their views, and it was a pleasure to meet them. The government has identified issues with extending rights to asylum seekers, and stated that only those with a legal right to remain should be enfranchised. But the Refugee Council has commented that in its current format, the bill draws an incorrect and uncomfortable association between people still in the asylum system and those who are living in Scotland without any form of leave to remain. If the legislative intent is to enfranchise citizens of all nationalities who are legally resident in Scotland, they believe it's inconsistent to exclude people in the asylum system, because whilst an asylum claim is pending, asylum seekers do have the lawful right to live in the UK pending the outcome of that claim. Many will eventually be recognised, just a sec, as refugees and given an extended period of leave to remain, although the decision-making process takes some time. That's the words of the Refugee Council. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary might address that point in his summing up at the end. They also point out, of course, that the Immigration Act is reserved, and again, could the Cabinet Secretary expand on the discussions that he may have had with the UK Government in relation to these issues? On prisoner voting, I know there's a... sorry, Mr Patterson, what?
Gil Patterson.
It's kind of you letting me in, Mr Finlay. It was just reflecting what you said, and I wonder if you would agree with me. I think hearing from evidence this morning, it was Pete Wildman, who's the chair of the Electoral Registration Committee, and he almost said that he did say it was presently it's unworkable for to administer this, to allow folk to vote. And so I wonder if you agree with me that the government should look very carefully at ways to circumvent this, to see what we can do to provide so that folk would be able to vote.
Neil Finlay.
You know, we can put men on the moon. I'm sure we can organise elections and expand the franchise. On prisoner voting, I know there are a wide range of views on this. There's a wide range of views within all political parties on this and in society. And people have a view on all prisoners and no prisoners getting the right to vote. The committee took a lot of evidence from the articulate and vocal advocates of various forms of prisoner voting, but we had very little from the other side of the debate. That's not to say that doesn't exist, it's just the committee heard very little from it. And I would have to say we've had very little evidence from the Tory benches today for their oppositionalist position. We know that the government cannot ignore ECHR, and it's been around for a very long time. However, I think the position the government puts is just not credible, because it's calling for prisoners serving a sentence of less than 12 months to be given the vote, then at the same time seeking to end 12 months, end short sentences. It's given with one hand and taken away with the other. And I think that's a contradictory position, and I think the government has to think about that. Presiding Officer, we're supposed to be in an era of evidence-led policy, so I think we should see the evidence for any proposal before we make a final decision.
I now call Adam Tompkins. Around 7 minutes, please, Mr. Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this has been a really good debate on a profoundly important issue. I just don't think there is a more profound issue for a parliamentary democracy to debate than the right to vote, and how we, just thinking about how we frame that argument, how should we even think and talk and discuss about the question of the reform of the franchise. And I think what we've heard during the course of the afternoon are a number of, if I may say so, really quite well put together arguments for a liberal progressive view of franchise reform, perhaps none quite so articulate as Alec Cole-Hamilton. And what I want to try and do in my remarks is to put I hope, thoughtful, conservative view about franchise and franchise reform. And there are thoughtful conservatives, Mr. Stevenson, and Disraeli was certainly one of them. Disraeli was certainly one of them, and was a key player in the 19th century moves to extend the franchise, as your history should not really have overlooked. And by the way, I love being able to correct Mr. Stevenson on a point of history. The first use of a secret ballot in the United Kingdom was in August 1872 in Pontefract, which is not quite what he said, but there we are. I want to start with a point of agreement with the Cabinet Secretary. He said in his opening remarks, and I agree with him, that no franchise stands still, that every franchise is and should be dynamic, and I agree with that. I think that's entirely right. We've heard that there is, throughout Western democracy, Presiding Officer, a global loosening of the link between citizenship and voting. And this is part of the journey of modern human rights. But when we started thinking about human rights, we started thinking, somebody mentioned the Enlightenment, although neither David Hume nor Adam Smith ever wrote about democracy or the right to vote, never mind. But when we started thinking about rights in the time of the Enlightenment, we thought about them in the context of birthrights, rights which we had by virtue of where we were born. And of course, that's arbitrary and we have no control of it. And these days, we tend not to think about rights in terms of birthrights. We tend to think about rights in terms of human rights, of universal rights. And that's what the government wants voting to become in Scotland. And they have a point. I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable approach to modern franchise law to think that the relationship between the franchise, this question of how we frame the debate about who has the right to vote should simply be a matter of lawful residency. I have no, as a point of principle, I have no difficulty in following the logic. Mr. Kelly talked about logic. I have no difficulty in following the logic of that. But I'm not ready yet to give up on citizenship. I'm not ready yet to abandon, I know it's an old language, but I'm not ready yet to abandon entirely the old language of birthrights. Of course I believe in universal human rights. I believe that free speech, in the right not to be tortured, and all manner of prisoners' rights, which Mr. Kerr talked about, are universal human rights, which do not depend at all on where you were born. Let me finish the point I'll happily give away. Which do not depend at all on where you were born. But I do still think that there are some things that I want to call rights, including the right to vote, which do link to citizenship, which don't extend merely to the thinness of residency. Now, when I've asked a number of speakers in this debate if they don't accept that argument, and I'm not saying everybody has to accept that argument, if they don't accept that argument, what value to them does citizenship still hold? And Mr. Russell said that he did not want to enter into a dissertation on citizenship. Well, we don't have to enter into a dissertation on anything, but I do think it behoves all of us to reflect on what it means for the future of citizenship in Scotland if we extend the franchise to everybody who is lawfully resident here. And I think Mr. Rowley, I've already said I'll give way to Mr. Finlay. I think Mr. Rowley was kind enough in his remarks to say that even though he didn't necessarily agree with the point I'm seeking to make, that there is a point there to be made, and there's something for us usefully to reflect on. I said I would give way to Mr. Finlay.
Mr. Tompkins spoke about citizens' rights. I was just checking while he was speaking there. Under EU citizens' rights, then under one of the treaties of the European Union, gives citizens the right to vote and stand in European and municipal elections. So there are citizens' rights that we have at the moment because of our membership.
Adam Tompkins.
It's a very good point, and I think it makes my point for me, that when the European Union at Maastricht started to talk about the idea of union citizenship, what rights did it accord to citizens? The right to vote and the right to stand in elections. These are rights which, even in EU law, are linked to citizenship. They're not linked to nationality or to residency, they're linked to citizens. If you are Canadian and you come into a European member state, there is no right in European law that is conferred upon you as a Canadian citizen to vote in elections in Europe. These are rights which append to European citizenship. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. I think, I'll happily give way in a moment, I think that there is still room for an argument that the franchise is appropriately linked to citizenship and should not be extended to everybody who is lawfully resident in a territory.
Mike Rumbles.
I appreciate Adam Tompkins giving way, but as far as I understand it, and I followed him and making a very good speech, but it slipped for me when you mentioned European citizenship. There's no such thing.
Well,
Adam Tompkins.
It was Mr. Finlay who brought up European citizenship, and there is such a thing. It was introduced into the treaties at Maastricht, and it has very few rights attached to it in the treaties, but the right to vote and stand in elections is one of them. I want to move on, Presiding Officer, to prisoners' right to vote. And again, I want to start with a point of agreement with the Cabinet Secretary. He said in his opening remarks that we must be ECHR compliant, and he is, of course, correct about that, both as a matter of policy and as a matter of law. We must be ECHR compliant, but the proposals to extend the franchise to every prisoner in Scotland who is serving a jail term of less than 12 months go much further than is necessary to comply with the European Court of Human Rights judgments on prisoners' right to vote. I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary is right when he says that if these provisions were challenged, the European Court of Human Rights would not find that they were disproportionate or irrational and would find that they fell within the margin of appreciation. But I do just want to close my remarks, if I've got time, Presiding Officer, with a few brief reflections on the problem with the Hurst judgment. The Hurst judgment is one of the worst judgments that the European Court of Human Rights has ever handed down. To start with, it is based on a false premise. It's based on a false premise which unfortunately was reflected in Alec Cole-Hamilton's otherwise excellent speech, and that is that there is a blanket ban on prisoners' right to vote in the United Kingdom. There isn't. Prisoners on remand are not excluded from the franchise. Prisoners who are in contempt of court are not excluded from the franchise. It is not a blanket ban. It is a ban which it is a general exclusion, not a blanket ban, which the European Court of Human Rights has, in my view, wrongly found to be unlawful, but it's not a blanket ban. That's the first problem. The second problem is, and this is a point which has been made by a number of speakers from these benches, there is quite deliberately no right to vote in the European Convention on Human Rights. The job of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg is to give effect to the words of the European Convention. The job of the European Court of Human Rights is not to invent new rights which don't appear in the Convention itself. And unfortunately, that's what the European Court of Human Rights did in Hurst. The European Court of Human Rights should not have done that in Hurst, not least because there is no European consensus on the question of prisoner enfranchisement, and there was therefore no respect in the Hurst judgment for the all-important margin of appreciation on which the Convention system depends, which is why, presiding officer, over the course of the 15 years since the Hurst judgment, the court has swithered on it, has in effect given up on it, has in effect backed down on it, and has never found that the United Kingdom's repeated, as it were, refusal to comply with this ill-considered judgment have resulted in any kind of damages which disenfranchised prisoners can seek from the United Kingdom or from any government within it, which is why the United Kingdom's approach to this, which is to allow prisoners released on temporary licence the right to vote, has been accepted by the Committee of Ministers. It has been accepted by the Committee of Ministers, which is the enforcement agency of the Council of Europe, which is why the Scottish Government is going in this bill much further than it needs to give effect to the ECHR's jurisprudence on prisoners' right to vote.
Thank you. I now call Michael Russell to wind up the debate. You can have 10 minutes, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you. This has been an interesting and varied debate. A great deal has been discussed during the afternoon, and I want to cover as much of it as I possibly can. There are a huge number of issues in here, although there are actually only 2 items within this bill. There has been a difference of opinion on both of those items, as I suppose was inevitable within this chamber. But let's see if I can bring together, Presiding Officer, the areas of agreement first. There is, on the franchise, an agreement by all but the Conservative Party that the reforms that are being recommended are a big step forward. And they are a big step forward because they are inclusive, and I shall come to Mr Tompkins, I think, helpful, though I disagree with it, but helpful issue of citizenship in a moment, and to try and move on to the area. But in terms of the agreement amongst the parties, there is an agreement that residence should be the qualification for voting. And I would say to those people who have tended to skate over the progress that this bill is making to immediately focus on the one group which is still to be decided, not to let the best be the enemy of the good. I have made it clear I would like to move on the issue of asylum seekers, but this bill makes enormous progress in other areas. So let us try and bank that progress, agree on that progress, get that progress to work, and if we can move any further, in an area which will have many difficulties, let's try and do so. And it would be wrong to throw out the progress we can make for the sake of the one item in which we are not yet able to make that progress. Let me now come on to Mr Tompkins' contribution on citizenship and residence. When I refused to enter into a dissertation, I think it was because I didn't think, I would like to make some progress. Because I do think there is an issue to be discussed here about the difference between residence and citizenship, if there is one. And I think we can enter into that as the bill progresses, because we might find an ability to draw the Conservative Party into support of this bill, and that would be helpful to everybody.
Excuse me, Cabinet Secretary, could I ask the Chamber to please cut down on the private conversations? It's getting very noisy. Mr Russell.
And let me make 2 contributions to that process. The first is that I think that residence is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for citizenship. So there's a relationship between residence and citizenship. And in here we are saying that residence is the qualification we should look for voting. But it is not necessarily the qualification we should look for example, for international protection. The UK passport, I think, still says that Her Britannic Majesty is Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, etc., etc. So there's an element, as there has been since the issuing of the first passports, that there was an element of international protection in passports. And there's a link to voting protection here. Lyndon Johnson observed that a man without a vote is a man without protection. So there is an issue in terms of rights within the state where residence takes place, which are protected by voting, which may not be protected by voting internationally. There is also the question of passing on citizenship, and it was touched upon by Mr Tompkins, and I think it is deserving of further consideration. But we have the possibility to explore that at stage 2. So let me just say that I think it is an issue that does need explored, and it would benefit the committee and it would benefit the Parliament if we understood the relationships in there. Another point that was raised was the point of money. I can confirm there will be £280,000 for the Electoral Commission, money that does need to be considered in terms of its spending, about how we can drive up participation and reach parts that presently are not reached. And I know that Mr Rowley, for example, raised these issues yesterday in the discussion of the referendum bill. There is a lively interest in this bill, in the referendum bill and in the elections bill about the issue of turnout and participation. And we shouldn't see this bill as standing on its own in those areas. We should draw the bills together and see what the resources are to see how we can affect that with all relevant authorities. I have to say, in the light of a discussion yesterday at the committee, with all relevant authorities working together. And I think the point that was made by Maureen Watt in terms of unconventional places where that might take place should certainly be considered. Let me now move on to the area of prisoner voting. The issue has been raised repeatedly that there is, in some sense, an overreach for what the Scottish Government is trying to do, and it could, and essentially this is the terms in which it has been expressed, get away with doing less. I'm not sure any government should try to get away with doing less if it believes that its position is based upon principle. And as I stressed early on, this is based not just on principle, but also on particular Scottish conditions. 12 months is the maximum sentence a judge can pass in cases heard without jury. It is the threshold for the government's presumption against short sentences. It was the most favoured option of the periods on which we were consulted. So there is a logic within this position. Moreover, there are concerns about the position that the UK government has taken. The Committee of Ministers, which has said and indicated it considers the action taken meets the requirement of the Hurst Court ruling, is the political body of the Council of Europe, responsible for the oversight of the implementation of judgment. It is for the Court alone to determine the requirements of the Convention. And although Mr Tompkins does not like the judgment and is part of a criticism of the judgment stands. And it is a government has to observe that judgment. It has to observe that judgment. And I think what we heard in terms of defying the judgment from the Tory benches was not wise. Not from Mr Tompkins, but from another speaker. But then we have to consider whether what the UK government has might withstand a court challenge. And let me quote the Welsh Assembly Equality, Local Government and Communities Committee in its report on the 11th of June, because I do agree with this point. We cannot take lightly the concerns raised, these were raised in evidence to the committee, that the current approach by the UK government of minimal compliance may not continue to be sufficient in the future. As legislators, we have to take very seriously the risk of failing to pass legislation that would be within competence. So to say that the Scottish Government is attempting to overreach on this, we may in actual fact be pitching the proposal not just on the basis of the arguments for that proposal, but also on the fact that we wish to make sure that we could withstand a challenge in the way that it may be the UK position could not withstand a challenge. And there is no option in this matter, and I just want to emphasise that. It was indicated that there might be some option whether or not we could do this. If the judgment stands, and the judgment does stand, and if this Parliament has responsibility for the franchise, which it has had for the last 3 years, we are obliged to make changes. There is a question of what changes they should be. If we believe changes made elsewhere are not sufficient and would not withstand challenge, it would be wrong and irresponsible of this government to put forward those as serious proposals. We must put forward a proposal that we believe will withstand challenge. And that is precisely what we are endeavouring to do with a 12-month proposal, which we believe is the right proposal and also one that could withstand and will withstand any challenge. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me reflect on franchise reform. I'm glad that Mr Tompkins agrees with me that franchises are dynamic and not static. And I have to say that I would not really want to take a position in any dispute between Mr Stevenson and Mr Tompkins, but I have to say that the truth lies somewhere between the two of them, in my view, because the Conservatives have certainly brought forward parliamentary and franchise reform in the past. The 1867 Act quoted under Lord Derby's premiership, of course, not Disraeli's, but in those circumstances that was brought forward in one form and massively revised and changed by opposition amendments, and it then became a much bigger bill. And why was that? Because Disraeli apparently believed that he could win an election based on a wider franchise. He lost the 1868 election. And repeatedly we see the Conservatives espousing reform when it benefits them. They opposed the Great Reform Bill because they believed that property as a basis of society and the Constitution would be destroyed. They opposed further extension until they thought they would benefit from it. They opposed vote for women until they thought they would benefit from it. They still oppose proportional representation, except here, where they have benefited from it. They oppose voting by 16 and 17-year-olds, and they oppose any meaningful reform of the House of Lords. And unfortunately, they're opposing today necessary changes to the franchise. Changes in terms of residents that modernise the franchise and take us forward, recognising the contribution of all who live here. And essential changes to the franchise which are required because of a judgment of the European Court. It is to be regretted that they still hold back on this. If only I could persuade the Tories that these changes would benefit them, I think they would jump to support it, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And that concludes Stage 1 debate on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. The next item is consideration of motion 19966 on a financial resolution for the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill. Could I call on Derek Mackay to move this motion?
Moved.
Thank you very much. And I'm minded to accept a motion without notice to bring forward decision time to now. Does anyone object? No. Minister, could I call on you to move a motion without notice?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So I will now put the question. The question is that decision time being brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. That's good. So moving to decision time. The first question is that motion 20049 in the name of Michael Russell on the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill at Stage 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20049 in the name of Michael Russell is yes 63, no 18. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. And our final question is that motion 19966 in the name of Derek Mackay on a financial resolution for the Scottish Elections Franchise and Representation Bill be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time and I close this meeting.